So I'd like to start, because this is, you know, I'm a professor, I'm an educator, and I don't think that necessarily talking at you is the best way to proceed, although I will be doing that. But I'd like to engage you in a question before I start. And I'd like for someone to just answer the question or consider how did the civil rights movement emerge? Why did they emerge?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? It cut out a little bit for me. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So why did the civil rights movement emerge? Why did the civil rights and Black Power movements, and how did they emerge? Why did they emerge? When they emerged?
Can I take a shot?
Half-baked answers are great. Yes.
It's probably really rather basic, but it was in response to basically the overwhelming oppression from the state and repression from the state that was at the time towards ethnic minority groups. And at the time, there was a lot of development in thought. For example, a lot of veterans who returned from World War II came back with ideas of egalitarianism and found that their home country didn't exactly meet up to those ideals. And this was spread throughout society and eventually developed into groups actually fighting for this cause in response to the state tyranny. And that became what was known as the Civil Rights Movement. I know that's extremely basic and oversimplified, but I hope it's at least a start.
Okay. Okay. So what I've heard is that the civil rights movement was in part a response to repression and inequality, and also returning Black soldiers from World War II noticed the contradiction between the service they gave to the country in war and their treatment domestically. Okay. Very quick summary of what I heard. Anyone else? Half-baked answers, just, you know, what you think, know, put on your Marxist hat. I imagine that some people here call themselves Marxists. Because ultimately, how are we going to do this, kids? Like, we got to really think objectively, strategically. Social movements are not a matter of will alone, although that's very important, right? So what led to the civil rights movement?
So in terms of like tangibly action-wise, I know that there were 4 students who did a sit-in at a lunch counter to protest the segregation at the lunch counter. And that in doing that, the reactions that they got from white people and racist people coming at them then became televised so that people across the country started seeing what was being done. So it wasn't this like quiet thing that was happening, in the, sort of closed off. It was something that was now like, you couldn't deny it because there were pictures and there was video. And so those people who wanted to just close their doors and pretend it wasn't happening, and by that I mean white people, because they were the ones who were able to do that, couldn't really deny it anymore. And so that was, in terms of like being a catalyst for that, along with the Montgomery bus boycott, it was becoming a lot more widely seen. The protests were starting to be undeniable. Not only these racist laws and behaviors, but also the ways that they were treated then, the protesters, the peaceful protesters, by police, the police brutality on top of the injustice of these laws.
Okay, so the actions of 4 students, sorry, so the actions of students, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
the actions of It's cutting out?
Slightly.
Is it cutting out?
A little bit.
Okay, so maybe I need to, let me put in my other, you know, old-fashioned connection, Ethernet. Hold on.
Okay, and two folks wanted to speak, Jorge and then Felix.
I wanted to venture an answer to the question. I know she's not here, but I'll just go ahead anyway. One of the, I mean, this is not really my country, so I might not be like an expert, but one of the things that I've read is that there were like a lot of pre-existing institutions in the South. Like there were the churches and the communist.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. I need you guys to respond quicker. Yes? Because we don't have that much time. Okay. So, so I heard something that the actions of 4 students on February 1st, 1960, captured the imagination of a generation. It hit the news and it inspired others to act. In fact, after the sit-in by those 4 students at Woolworth's, students from the North came to the South and proceeded to engage in this action known as the sit-in across the region. And it crescendoed, and by April, all of these students who proceeded to engage in this model of protest that captured the imagination of a generation came together in a conference in part inspired by Ella Baker, that formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So there was an action taken, others followed suit because they were inspired by it, but that alone didn't a movement make. It actually took the leadership of someone who was much more experienced to say, okay, kids, this is great. What are we gonna do with it? Let's form an organization of young people that distinguish itself from the politics of the Southern Christian leadership slick, of which Martin Luther King was a part. A little older, more conservative. We need something more militant and radical. And what's the organization that's going to house that? Figure it out. Let's talk about it in a conference in April. Okay, anything else? So now you're talking, Fatima, about individual action that made a huge difference and was critical. What else? What else is going on that leads to the civil rights and Black Power movement? A movement that produced other movements, the women's movement, the gay and lesbian liberation movement, the anti-war movement, etc. So what forces on the ground are at work that move the country, right? It's not just protests, but it's also on a large scale protest. There was lots of that, but there's also local organizing and all kinds of organizations emerge. What forces are operating here that lead to the civil rights movement? Anybody else? I'll take one more answer, and half-baked is fine.
Jorge and Felix had wanted to add something.
Okay, Jorge.
I don't know if this is where you're going, so I'm like a little bit hesitant, but I know that even before the movement started, there were already a lot of these organizations and like churches and like remnants of Communist Party projects, like organizing projects in the South. Like I know, for example, Rosa Parks went to like some of those trainings before the bus incident. So I just know that there was like already like some sort of like network of organizations that existed there.
Yeah, there had long been struggle and organization and political engagement. Wherever there's oppression, there's a fight back. But oppression alone doesn't a mass movement make, right? The fact is that people had been oppressed in the South since God was a boy, Black people. But it took almost 100 years since the end of the Civil War for a civil rights movement to emerge. Why did it take so long? right? People had fought back, but it hadn't been successful. Jake?
Yeah, so able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thinking in kind of a big picture, sort of a semi-Marxist sense, I think, is that in this post-World War II environment, this is where the U.S. has, everyone knows the U.S. was on top of the world, but it needs to be stated how gigantically the U.S. was on top of the world monetarily in terms of power. So all the contradictions and oppressions of this capitalist colonial society become ever more so. You had this white working class that many people start to move up in it, become this middle class. A lot of the working class movements that existed in a few decades prior started kind of losing some of their momentum because more people are doing well, but Black Americans are by and large not benefiting from this. You're getting this effect of economy and industry that's ever further separating, creating this hierarchy in society. And so there's kind of more, it's not like there wasn't a need before, but the America kind of changes shape a little bit.
So America is changing shape a little bit during this period. And one of the biggest things that emerges is that the United States becomes hegemonic after World War II. It becomes a world power unequivocally. It had attempted to do that during World War I, but now by World War II, the United States is dominating economically and politically around the world for reasons that we don't have time to talk about. And it is competing with the USSR for world dominance. And the persistence of racism really is a kink in the armor of American hegemony, because it essentially suggests that this struggle against communism and for democracy abroad is a hoax, because look how Black people are treated. And in fact, Japan and communists abroad use the persistence of lynchings in the United States to delegitimize US power abroad. So the Cold War, in fact, has an impact on the civil rights movement. It actually forces the United States to address the issue of Black equality at the level of Washington and Congress in order to save face internationally. So global politics are now at stake. Okay, I'm gonna move on and talk about the conditions. Because conditions, economic conditions matter, material conditions matter. Movements don't emerge because people act alone. So there's a complex coming together of forces that produce social movements. What were the conditions? There was a demographic transformation of life in the United States. There was a mass migration of Black Americans from countryside to city. They went from being sharecroppers to becoming part of the working class in southern cities and in northern cities. Demographic transformation, they were being pulled in by the promise of wartime jobs during World War II. In the North, where they migrated in large numbers to cities like Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, massive numbers of people. It's known as the mass migration of Black Americans. In the North, they could vote, whereas in the South, they could not. Black Americans, that is. And so they became critical in elections. Elections have historically been close in the United States. And now, because of this mass migration, Black Americans represented 2 to 4% of the electoral vote. In something like, in quite a number of states that control something like 244 of the electoral college votes, right? So that meant that Black Americans gained political power. Whoever they voted for was likely going to determine the election, the presidential election, one way or the other. So for the first time in the history of the United States, because of this mass migration, Truman makes Harlem an election stop. Had never happened before in 1948. Had never happened before in US history. So the demographic transformation that turns Black Americans into workers gives Black Americans economic power that they never had before, but it also gives them political power because they're migrating to the North where they can vote. Then there's the world politics, right? The Cold War and the ways in which Black oppression in the United States exposes the lie of American democracy. And then there are dramatic events like the killing of Emmett Till, right? Which galvanized people and the actions of the 4 students, but also the organizations that are built in part because with this proletarianization of Black people and the growth in political power among Black people, that community, which had been downtrodden and oppressed and hadn't been able to fight and win before in the South, gets a sense of confidence, right? You kind of get a sense that, okay, here we are, we can win now. And so all of these organizations grow. The NAACP grows enormously in terms of its membership. So there's a kind of optimism that comes with better economic and political conditions. So social movements are not a matter of will alone. All of these things, social, economic factors, organization and leadership, but also the development of a strategy are what produce movements and sustain them over time. And this is both a local thing and a national thing. There were local movements like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the campaigns of the Montgomery bus boycott, local, that came together with national strategies like the March on Washington, right? Which was previously a March on Washington movement during World War II that threatened to paralyze the country during war. And that March on Washington movement didn't happen, but it was organized by Black labor. It was the Black labor that attempted to mobilize, to come to Washington to protest discrimination in wartime jobs, and also discrimination in the military and segregation in the military. But that was such a threat that the president at the time, Roosevelt, cut a deal and said, okay, I'll pass Executive Order 8802 so that you guys don't come to Washington in the middle of the war, right? Strategy, that strategy was so brilliant that it carried over from World War II to 1963, when the march finally happened. It was a March on Washington movement during World War II because it never happened, but there was a buildup and organization on the part of the Black working class that threatened to paralyze Washington, D.C., but also exposed the United States in the middle of this war. Okay, so why are the 60s important? The 60s are important because they civilized America. They changed the relationship between Black people and more generally people of color and white Americans. And a movement with many different spokes, with radicals like Malcolm X and moderates like Martin Luther King and militant students like those who populated this SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, re-educated the country around issues of race, right? They actually stopped America in its tracks and business as usual through militant action in the streets, dramatic actions, the rise of the Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, this conversation about Blackness and Black is beautiful. So militancy in the streets and movements and their organizations and what they propose, that's what changes history. It took the American Revolution to get us the Constitution and the notion that all men are created equal, not electoral politics, right? So the 60s also educated Americans on issues of gender with the rise of the women's movement. It actually challenged US foreign policy in the middle of the Cold War through the teachings of the anti-war movement, right? This notion of a teaching emerges and is popularized at the University of Wisconsin when school stops, professors remove themselves from the classroom, out of the campus, and with students, they organize a teach-in that starts like at 7 p.m. one day and it ends the next morning on US foreign policy, French colonization of Vietnam, and why the United States is in Vietnam. And then this captures the imagination of students, and then all of these teach-ins against the war happen all across the country in universities across the country. So this is what's important about the civil rights and Black power and anti-war movements, the 60s. They transformed the relationship between Black people and white people, people of color and white people. They challenged US foreign policy domestically, hadn't happened before. They changed our understanding of gender. And there's another one, but also our understanding of sexuality and heteronormativity. There was a cultural revolution produced by this decade, and also it produced, it integrated Black people and women and other people of color into the ruling class as a result of civil rights legislation, which is why we have Obama and Ellen on television. Huge, but it created challenges, right? Because now people think that that Black faces in high places and gendered faces in high places is movement forward, and what we need to continue to do through the electoral process. Okay, the Young Lords. So the Young Lords and the Black Panthers emerge during the second half of the decade after a radicalization has taken place in these movements. People realize there is a much deeper problem than discrimination. This is a structural problem. It's a problem with capitalism and imperialism. And of course, these movements are not happening independently of what's going on in the world. There are also revolutions against European imperialism happening across Asia and Africa that start immediately after World War II that are also influencing the politics of US radicals. In Cuba, the Cuban Revolution influences the politics of US radicals, but also introduces Marxist analysis and broadens the influence of Marxist analysis on a large scale. The writings of Frantz Fanon, who's a psychiatrist from Martinique, who supports the Algerian Revolution, those ideas are influencing the politics of 60s radicals, Marxists, and so are the politics of China and Mao. So the Young Lords emerged at the height of radicalization in 1969, and the organization reflects the best politics of the period. At its start, it says, oh, women's oppression is a problem. Its 13-point program says down with women's oppression. Machismo has to be revolutionary, which is a contradiction that gets challenged in the organization. It says we want a socialist society, point 13. But the Young Lords are Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalists who also call themselves socialists. And their first point essentially attempts to expose the United States' quiet imperial project in Puerto Rico. And so its first point calls for the liberation of Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans migrated alongside of African Americans to cities like Chicago and New York on a mass scale during this period. More Puerto Ricans migrated to New York in the post-war period than African Americans, by the way. So we have a situation in which Puerto Ricans who are Spanish speaking are entering the same conditions and neighborhoods where Black Americans live in Harlem, East Harlem, the Lower East Side, and beyond. So these Latinos who are migrants, but also citizens of the United States, but they have a kind of colonial citizenship because Puerto Ricans can't vote in Puerto Rico, but they can vote in the mainland. And the United States controls the politics of Puerto Rico. And in fact, it's the US-led industrialization project in Puerto Rico, Operation Bootstrap, that displaces all of these Puerto Rican peasants that can't be absorbed in the new industrial economy on the island, that leads to this mass migration of Puerto Ricans from the island to the mainland, wherein a third of the people of the island of Puerto Rico come to New York and Chicago and Philadelphia. That's what colonization looks like. A third of the people of the island end up here because, and this is a planned migration, because they knew that the industrialization project of the island, which essentially welcomed US business to the island and provided tax breaks, not unlike what happened during NAFTA, by the way, which is why we've got Mexicans in New York, because farmers in Mexico were displaced on a mass scale. And where did they come? Up north. And by the way, this industrialization project in Puerto Rico was the strategy used by US empire to crowbar its way into Latin America and the rest of the third world economically. This is how the United States managed a template and a laboratory for capitalist penetration in the third world after World War II. Puerto Rico was the test case. So you've probably heard of the maquiladoras, the maquiladora industry in Latin America, which exploited seamstresses and women. That strategy of figuring out, okay, how do we do this? That's what Operation Bootstrap was about. How do we industrialize third world countries? How do we establish a capitalist economies? Okay, so that led to this mass migration of Puerto Ricans to New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And then this meant that Puerto Ricans were migrating at a very special moment of upheaval and uprising during the civil rights movement, which is why Puerto Ricans, in the form of the Young Lords, make common cause with Black Americans. So conditions matter. Forces matter. Revolution is not a matter of will. And I'm telling you this. And I focus my remarks around this in particular because I've been in conversations recently with people who've been offended when I've said, for example, that there hasn't been a potent enough civil rights and Black power movement in Latin America that's reached the mainstream, which is true. I mean, Latin America is a big place, and some Black power movements in Latin America have been most successful than others, but generally that hasn't happened. And that doesn't mean that people haven't fought and been killed. But the question is, what combination of social forces are needed to actually penetrate the mainstream, create leadership, but also the kinds of very deliberate strategies, political, that could make a difference and win reforms in an unequivocal way. All kinds of things are needed. Social forces, demographic forces, economic, political, but also the organization, strategy, and politics of radicals. So what did the Young Lords do? Because they emerged in 1969 at the height of revolutionary politics in the United States and in the world. In 1969, 2 million students said in the United States that they believed in the importance of building a revolutionary party. Not an electoral politics party, a revolutionary party. In fact, the Young Lords wanted nothing to do with the electoral process or with politicians. Don't matter how radical they are, because they believed that change comes through mass upheaval protest on the ground. Local organizing. Think about it. Why is it that we have a conversation today around the abolition of the police or even defunding the police? It took people burning down a police department in Minneapolis, which, by the way, 50%, 52% of Americans said that it was called for, that it was a legitimate thing, which is shocking. Shocking. Really? In America, 52% of Americans thought that that was called for, that it makes sense why that might have happened. So that struggle, that unfortunately riots are the language that America listens to when it comes to the oppression of Black people. It's the only language. The Colin Kaepernicks of the world sat down. They kneeled. That was a disaster on wheels. The man got thrown out of town. He couldn't play anymore. Everything was tried, but when people riot, all of a sudden, Americans listen. So I'm talking about what is it that changes history and that shifts consciousness unequivocally. The Occupy Wall Street protests at the turn of the century, right? Was it at the turn of the century? Made critiques of capitalism acceptable on a mass scale. It wasn't our friend Bernie Sanders. He rode the wave. He rode the wave of that radicalization. But October 8th is also the anniversary when the man was going to be executed. Was executed. Who am I thinking about? This happened at around the same time as Occupy Wall Street. Lord Jesus, I can't remember his name, but a man was executed. A Black man was executed who was certainly innocent.
The one in Georgia, I think.
I will tell you in a minute, because I need to, and I'm going to clearly go over just a little bit, but the person I'm thinking about is, and I am embarrassed, and you should be embarrassed too, that we don't remember. No one can look this up?
Was it Troy Davis?
Troy Davis.
Troy Davis?
Jesus
Yeah.
Christ. Troy Davis. Troy Davis. That created a conversation around the carceral state and the new face of racism in American society. And there were protests, but a lot of it happened on the internet. But then the kid was killed. Then there were a number of other killings of murders of Black people in the country. And then we have this Black Lives Matter movement emerging. So this, and that comes on the heels of the recession of 2008, which pretty much turned people under 30 or under 35 into gig workers. Objective conditions. Objective objective conditions, not will alone, but objective conditions. So, okay, so where am I going with this? So the Young Lords, right, 2 million, so 2 million people say, students say that that building a revolutionary organization is critical in 1969. At that point, the Young Lords, many of whom are students, others are not, because the Young Lords emerges as a street organization in Chicago that's transformed into a political organization by its leader, Cha-Cha Jimenez. And then Fred Hampton, who's the leader of the Chicago Black Panther Party, gets involved and says we need to form a rainbow coalition, a coalition of Black Americans in the Black Panther Party, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in the Young Lords, but poor whites from Appalachia. We all share class interests, and we need to come together and fight on that basis and have each other's back, right? Again, this is an extension. By this time, people in the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords call themselves Marxists, although they argue that because of the legacy of European white supremacy and imperial rule in Europe and domestically, the fight against racism is one that has to be led by Black people and Puerto Ricans and Native Americans and Asian people. And we need to form our own organizations to ensure that these issues of race, which are so integral to the birth of capitalism, are not sidestepped. Okay, but the Young Lords at that point, who emerged in 1968, they, here in New York, after Chicago, a chapter emerges here in New York, they decide very consciously, we're gonna leave college campuses and we're gonna start working in the community around the clock. Local grassroots organizing. We're gonna meet every day. We're going to have an office. We are going to identify campaigns that pull people into them. And what were the campaigns they organized? One around garbage collection, which was a hot mess, a mess on wheels, not just in Puerto Rican and Black American communities, but in the United States, in part because the economy, again, conditions. The economy of the 1950s produces more garbage because it's organized around consumption than the system can actually absorb. So it's no surprise, this is what I discovered, it's no surprise that when they ask the Young Lords, the community is like, forget about, you know, lofty politics. Let's just pick up the garbage. Let's fix the problem of the garbage because we are living in filth. And their protests, which burn garbage in the streets for months on end every day, get a transformation in the policies of sanitation in New York. So alternate side of the street parking, which is a disaster on wheels for me today because I have a car, is a product of the struggles of the 60s. And the pressure put on the municipal government to provide decent services to New Yorkers. The Young Lords also identified lead poisoning as a problem. They came together with technicians at Metropolitan Hospital, doctors, nurses, and workers, and they went door to door and tested children for lead poisoning, and they embarrassed the city. They conducted a sit-in at the Department of Public Health, and they had press conferences daily, essentially telling New Yorkers, oh, a third of the people that we've, children that we've tested test positive for lead poisoning, which is a neurotoxin that produces brain damage and death. Muckrake, militant action, use of media to expose the government. And by the next year, the municipal government was forced to create the Bureau of Lead Poisoning and the first anti-lead poisoning legislation in New York. And in 1974, because of this community action, grassroots work combined with militancy, the Journal of Public Health identifies the work of the Young Lords as critical link in this reform. Lead poisoning had been discussed a million times before by a million actors and one-time protests, but it took a sustained campaign that targeted government and that created a crisis in the city, stopping traffic for blocks and blocks and blocks on end, going all the way down to downtown from the Lower East Side, not the Lower East Side, from East Harlem uptown, in the context of a mayoral campaign, right? The mayoral campaign was happening for this to be resolved. But also all of the muckraking around lead poisoning. Then they took over a hospital, Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx, alongside of friendly doctors, nurses, and hospital workers. And it was a whole strategy. They first started with a table in the emergency room taking complaints. That didn't work. They delivered the complaints to the hospital administration. And they figured out that they were going to take over. It was a dramatic action. They took over the hospital. They called the media. They had a press conference. By the end of the summer, they drafted the first known patient Bill of Rights, which everyone takes for granted today, organized around this concept, which was a reality, not a concept. They named the problem. There's this thing called medical discrimination against people of color, migrants, and Black people. It's a disaster on wheels. It kills people. And this is what it looks like. Let's humanize the situation. Who's the person who was killed because of malpractice in the hospital? Her name was Carmen Rodriguez, who died, the first person to die of an abortion at the state level. Before abortion was legalized nationally, it was legalized in the States and New York. And this was the first abortion death because of a botched abortion by a medical school student who didn't check the record, who was unsupervised. And so they took this case, they muckraked around it, they wrote about it in their newspaper, and they, at the end of the summer, created this document known as the Patient Bill of Rights. This is before doctors became reconstructed. Doctors used to think that everyone was a child of a lesser God, regardless of race, but especially in the case of people of color and poor people. And they said, oh, we have the right to know what you're doing to us. And we have the right to make a decision about our care. Basic things that we take for granted today was a product of a struggle. Okay, beyond that, so local organizing, door to door, literally, public education, using militancy to shift the terms of debate, organization. The Young Lords succeeded in part because they adopted hook, line, and sinker the organizational structure of the Black Panther Party. If they had not, they wouldn't have accomplished anything, because it takes 100 years to figure out how you're going to organize yourselves. They literally adopted the model of protest and organization of the Black Panther Party, and they hit the ground running. They were Marxist, self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninists. They had a critique of capitalism. They believed that organizing at the bottom of society was the way to go. They organized the lumpen proletariat. They believed that that was the most revolutionary class in society, which is a departure from traditional Marxism, which identifies workers as the most revolutionary class in society, not because of morality, objectively speaking, because the working class produces the wealth in society and can collectively remove its labor power from society and shut the system down. But the Young Lords and the Black Panthers emerge, and I'm going to end now, and maybe we can have 15 minutes for discussion. I'm happy to go over. The Young Lords and the Black Panthers, and the Black Panthers, of course, are critical and foundational. They were the socialists of the period who popularized critiques of capitalism through the boldest of actions. They armed themselves to police the police. That in many ways is comparable to burning up the Minneapolis police department. Although part of what the Young Lords and the Black Panthers tried to do was to organize what they perceived as the mass disaffection of society that they saw in the urban rebellions that began in 1963 in Birmingham, but then moved up north to LA and to New York and Detroit. So part of what these revolutionary organizations did was that they organized the militancy that was a possibility expressed in the rebellions, only a possibility. They organized this and gave it political expression. So the reason why the Young Lords and the Black Panthers identified the lumpen proletariat as the most revolutionary class in society is because these Marxists were groping to understand the world around them materially. After World War II, what we see in the cities is the emergence of a permanent class of young people, a permanently unemployed class of young people who are permanently unemployed because they leave the workforce because they've already tried to get jobs over the course of a year and have failed miserably. So they get discouraged and they drop out of the labor force. Why? Because even though we think of deindustrialization as something that affects white workers, before it gripped the white working class, it affected and devastated poor Black, Puerto Rican, and Mexican urban neighborhoods. So deindustrialization begins in American cities after World War II in places like Detroit. Companies essentially leave the cities to the suburbs and the South in stages. And so for the first time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1966 identifies this permanent class of unemployed people between the ages of like 16 and 29. And in New York, it says that 40% of youth in this age range are Puerto Rican, who are permanently unemployed, and a comparable number, a little less, are composed of youth who are African American. So the Young Lords and the Black Panthers are seeing this development and attempting to apply some kind of materialist politics to their organizing. Yeah. I can talk more. Perhaps you can ask me questions, but they won radical reforms through militant, uncompromising, fierce organizing in the streets that worked in coalition with doctors and hospital workers. They were also radicals who reflected the aesthetic and captured the imagination of their generation. They wore the beret. They had the thing that attracted people of their generation. They put their finger on the pulse politically and aesthetically of the moment. Most importantly, what the Young Lords accomplished was that they gave Puerto Ricans a coming out party, and they challenged the criminalization of Puerto Rican and the perception of Puerto Ricans as bad hombres. If you look at the literature and the ways in which Puerto Ricans and Black Americans, especially Puerto Ricans, are discussed, they're discussed like Mexicans are discussed. But the militancy of the Young Lords and their eloquent and beautiful actions and campaigns transformed their image and the image of Puerto Ricans in the city. From bad hombres to these fierce, articulate, badass, you can't mess with them radicals. They did that, but they also gave their generation of Puerto Ricans the language with which to understand the mass migration and of Puerto Ricans to the mainland and the trauma of migration, right? Because migration comes with trauma. And they help their generation understand and articulate the social forces that produce this mass displacement and the implication of US imperialism in that mass displacement and super exploitation of Puerto Rican migrants when they arrived. They also made common cause with the most demeaned, the most criminalized, radicals of the time, the Black Panther Party. Had they not made common cause with the Black Panther Party, the most iconic organization of that period, which we understand today, we wouldn't be talking about the Young Lords. So an enormous amount of solidarity and courage, because Puerto Ricans were not about the Black American struggle necessarily, but that was an argument that they forged in the streets and with their generation, that in fact, you can't understand racism in the United States without understanding the legacy of slavery and Black American oppression and anti-Black racism and white supremacy. And we share a relationship to colonialism with Black Americans because we are a colony, but we also share a similar class interest. And finally, the Young Lords was one of the most ethnically diverse organizations of the 60s. 30%, approximately 25% of its membership was composed of Black Americans, and another 5% was composed of other people from Latin America, Dominicans, Colombians, Mexicans. And in many ways, they were between two periods. They were betwixt the period of the 60s, but also the period that came after in the 70s and 80s. And their campaigns suggest as much, right? They were in many ways fighting against what we now know as neoliberalism, the budget cuts. All of these hospitals were experiencing budget cuts, and they turned their attention to these issues. I'll leave it there.
I'm gonna ask the first question. So in your book, you talk a little bit about, obviously you've been explaining like the local organizing, but they also tie it to internationalist issues. And I think that that's really important to look back to and think about like how we want to do that, because the most important way to build power is to build community and to build you know, with your coworkers and all of that, but maybe talking about how they did do that, tying their work with what was going on internationally.
Okay, great. So I've talked a lot. So can I have I will write these down. So other questions or comments, reactions?
Felix had a comment in the chat. Would you like to read it, Felix?
Sure, yes. The material like what you were mentioning, like how Marx focused on the proletariat more, and how the Young Lords seem to see a lot of potential in the lumpen thanks to their specific circumstances. It reminds me of how like the Maoists and the Chinese Marxists focus on the peasantry because of the different material circumstances at their time. So adapting to your current circumstances is pretty important.
Absolutely. I mean, yes. Mm-hmm.
Fatma?
Yeah, thank you so much. I've learned so much just from, you know, the short time. So, but the question that I had was, one of the points that you brought up was that, you know, it's all of these conditions that need to come together for a movement to really be successful. So just to get your perspective on where you think we are now in terms of all of those conditions, which is related to what I just said about, you know, international things as well.
Evan has a question.
Actually, I'm sorry, it's me, Jessica. We're sharing the screen. So what I was going to ask about was really the legacy of the Young Lords, and maybe you get into that into your book. But you know, we know the Black Panther Party suffered from being targeted and a direct plan by the government to destroy, basically, and end this threatening movement. And I'm just wondering about the Young Lords, particularly because we don't. I mean, I can say in general education for a person today, we don't hear a lot, I think, about the Young Lords, like whether there was a targeted plan because they were seen as a threat, or what is the legacy? Thank you.
A legacy of repression.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Locally, in New Brunswick today, we have that march at 3 o'clock. One of the organizers, Juan Gonzalez, was a young lord, and just maybe talking about like what they sort of, what Jessica was talking about also, but like what people have been working on since the 60s.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Comments? Or you know, what do you think is most interesting and compelling? Just because it helps me to think about how to talk about this work.
I guess if I could go, you mentioned like how they focused on local issues in the muck and muckraking. What do you think? I guess for some communities, lead is still an issue. So I guess I could still maintain adapting to current public health crises like the current pandemic. Do you see any other approaches that I guess modern leftist organizations should go for in terms of trying to replicate that, I guess?
So great, thank you. Anyone else?
I just wanted to add again, thank you so much for doing this. I may have to jump off for another reading group, but I really appreciate you taking the time to connect all these different things and to really give us a really strong focus on the material conditions that we're also having to like focus on. So I really appreciate that emphasis. And you're right, there's a lot of Marxists in this group, but it's always a great thing when we have somebody like yourself who's able to pull these things together and really remind us and provide us that kind of lens, which is really critical. So thank you for that.
Okie doke, thank you. Anyone else? So I'll take other comments. Yeah, anyone else? Someone raise their hand. I'll start. Anyone? I'll start by saying that, okay, what was important about the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and other Marxists and socialists is that they actually attempted to use that politics, that framework, as a science for intervening in the world. It's not something that you just talk about. It's actually something that has to be applied, right? That should help you identify the crisis today, where it stands, where it is, so that you can organize a campaign on the ground around it for the purposes of transforming society, right? We need a strategy. This is not particular to Marxists, but Trump and his people, and even the Democrats, have a strategy. And they are going to go to the grave fighting for their strategy, because they're about winning. They're about maintaining their power. So that's why all of the mayors around the country, regardless of their party, are working with the police to pull down this emerging movement, right? And whoever ends up in Washington will do similarly. Because the ruling class intends, by hook or crook, to maintain its power. And this is where repression comes in, and it's the first question that was asked. Oh yes, the young lords were completely infiltrated. The COINTELPRO project of the FBI, the counterintelligence program of the FBI, infiltrated the young lords. The young lords, of course, disconnected themselves from the grassroots when they decided that they were going to go organize in Puerto Rico for national independence, which was a terrible mistake. But I suspect that that project was also politically pushed by those who had infiltrated the organization. And the last chapter of my book, really the last two chapters, talk about police. Police worked very closely with the counterintelligence program of the FBI. And in fact, if you think about it, infiltration is not a national project, it's a local one. And police were hugely involved and central to the destabilization of radical organizations. And I sued the NYPD in 2014 for the surveillance records of the young lords. And in 1916, after 2 years of struggle in the courts, I won the recovery of the handshoe files, the largest cache of surveillance records by police of New Yorkers from 1954 to 1971, including those of Malcolm X, over 1 million records that are now available to the public at the Municipal Archive of the City of New York. So this is happening as we speak. We know this, but the police are not just there, they're there to protect the state and private property at the local level. And part of that job is surveillance and repression. And it's happening now. So yes, that's one of the legacies, but I'd like to think that the legacies of the young lords are, you know, these radical reforms that I'm talking about, the lead poisoning legislation, the popularizing of this literally patient bill of rights. That's what it's called today, and that's what they called it. Of course, they had a much radical patient bill of rights, which argued that healthcare is a human right and shouldn't be organized around profit, but around human need. And they organized, they called for healthcare at the local level with health captains in every block, and doctors and nurses and social workers and mental health people going door to door to engage in preventative healthcare modeled after the Cuban example. So those really are their legacies, and they were part of this very robust and creative movement that brought Black and brown people, or African Americans and Puerto Ricans, together in common cause, right? Two communities that are thought of as constantly warring. Those, I think those are the legacies, and they also exposed the US colonial project in Puerto Rico, and educated the new left about the colonial character of American society. International solidarity, they did it in brilliant ways. They called all of their campaigns offensives in deference to the Tet Offensive of the Vietnamese in 1968, a campaign launched by the Vietnamese guerrillas that for the first time targeted American military installations in the cities rather than in the jungle. And this captured the war like never before, because the fighting happened in the cities where journalists could capture the horrors of war at a moment when the American government was telling the American people that the war was ending. Here you had the devastation of war captured by journalists in the cities, in Vietnam, in Saigon and Hue. And this turned the war around. It fueled the anti-war movement. and led in part to the removal of American troops from Vietnam, although the people who really won that removal were the Vietnamese and the guerrillas, which gave the United States a big headache. I mean, the Vietnamese defeated the Americans in war. A country that the US President Johnson had called a raggedy ass little third-rate nation, defeated the biggest empire. So the Young Lords actually, in very creative ways, just calling their lead campaign the lead offensive, the garbage offensive, the Lincoln offensive, in solidarity with the Vietnamese, and explaining that, and engaging in urban guerrilla protests. That's what they called their offensive. We're engaging in urban guerrilla protests in the cities. But also their newspaper reported on the goings-on in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. So this was an integral part of their understanding of local conditions. They called the neighborhoods in which they lived the colony, which I found hilarious. The Black Panthers and the Young Lords, they were like, oh, I'm going back to the colony, which popularized a sense that in the United States, people of color, racialized people, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Black Americans, have a colonial relationship to the nation. But that there was also this thing called colonization of Europeans in Africa and Asia, but also of the United States in Latin America, that we needed to understand, and that that US imperialism abroad comes home sooner or later, and it's part of the same policy. So there's a new book out that suggests and argues and explains the ways in which the police in the United States and its expansion after World War II came in the form of training police in Guatemala and Iran and in all of the countries where the United States was fueling a counter-revolutionary movement against people seeking democracy. So people in the police in New York and Philadelphia and all over were trained to train terrorist forces abroad. And those same tactics were brought here. And that is how the militarization of the police begins, with US foreign policy, right? Which then suggests that there's no way, there's no snowball's chance in hell that we can reform the police in the United States. Okay, so where are we now? Like, what do I think about the movements now? I think the movements now are complex. They're still in the process of being nourished, developing. My hope, and this is probably already in the works, is that we go from mass uprisings and mass demonstrations, which are important, but can also be episodic, to consistent organizing on the ground and the emergence of organizations. We need not one, we need different organizations emerging with different perspectives connected to the grassroots. And I'm sure that that's already happening in ways that we don't know about because the media is not reporting on it. So we need an engine that is going to educate the movement about the movement. And that existed in the 60s. Liberation News Service was an engine that essentially brought in all of the stories of struggle across the country and redistributed that story to the same movement. Oh, did you know that these folks are doing this there? Right? In a concerted manner. I think that, I think that we need to look at the areas of society that have possibility for organization and struggle. I think that the hospitals and nurses are clearly an engine of this economy, that begging for organization within the union, outside of the union, with the community. It already started. It was the nurses and the doctors, to a lesser extent doctors, but technicians, who were at the forefront of this horror that we know as the failed state in the era of COVID-19. They took the streets, they protested in valiant ways. There's an opportunity there. Those unions need to be revitalized. Teachers, we need to think about, like, okay, where is struggle in the working class? Because ultimately, we're gonna need working people to defend the life of Breonna Taylor at the point of production. We need working people. The TWU workers, the Transit Workers Union, paralyzed New York, I think in 2006 or 2005, 2004, and it was a sight to behold. Paralyzed, they went out on strike. Sight to behold, New York paralyzed. We need those struggles to link up with struggles in the community. And the people who run TWU are the same people whose children are killed by the police, who run the trains, not TWU. TWU is the union. Yeah, we need a combination, and I'm sure we have, and I know there's some conferences going on, Black Lives Matter conferences, national and local. We are probably underdeveloped in the area of the local, and this is a difficult challenge now in the era of COVID. But I want to see and hear and know about the organizations that are doing dynamic work on the ground, that are using strategy to gain concrete reforms. There was an occupation of City Hall in the aftermath of the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd killings here in New York City. That was a strategy. I don't know what happened to that. We need an assessment of what happened. What happened? We occupied City Hall. Did that work? There was an attempt to defund the police. Does defunding the police really work? Because I hear that they've done a musical chairs with the funding. We need to develop a clearer and mainstream. There's an analysis out there, but that analysis now has to be tied to organization, locally and nationally. And this is probably a process in the making somewhere in Portland, in Louisiana, probably in Georgia. But we need to know about it. We need to learn from what people are doing right now, and we need to assess our victories and our failures politically. And there are plenty of people who are in the conversation, right? Sometimes I think our conversations might get diffused on the internet because individuals are putting out the analysis, but we need to think collectively, right? We're going to do this collectively. And I know that there are folks who are doing this collectively, and we need to amplify those stories. But also, ultimately, it's going to take a group of people who are going to do something and a kind of organization that's going to tap into the zeitgeist of this moment, right? Like the Black Panthers. They did something that was badass, that grew their organization exponentially. We need to figure out what that is for today. And that's why analysis of social, political, and economic conditions is important, right? If you're an actor in this period. Political education is also hugely important. Like the people in the 60s were reading around the clock and doing the work. and engaged around the clock in this conversation about how we're going to do this. With a very sophisticated framework, regardless of what you think about their politics. It was an attempt at a sophisticated strategy and framework and politics that could be applied in the world, because the object is to win, not just to fight, but to win. And what levers do we have to pull to win or to push this forward? And we've done tremendously, because we are talking about the abolition of the police in American society today, something that was never imaginable. Okay, I think I've talked about all of the Juan Gonzalez, who's also the co-anchor of Democracy Now!, has kept on it. He's also the author of an incredible book called Harvest of Empire, about US imperialism in Latin America and Latinx populations in the United States as byproduct of US economic and foreign policy in the region. It's an excellent book. You should all get it, because people from the global South and African Americans stand to be the majority in the United States. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing this unhinged neo-Nazi, proto-fascist backlash on the part of Trump and many that came before. It's the last gasp in a society whose demographic composition is forever altered, right? So we need to understand that if we're going to fight against that. And we need to also understand the implication of the Democratic Party in this conversation, right? But I do think that Trump is Trump is a very dangerous white supremacist, in part because he has a personality disorder. He's personality disordered. One could argue that capitalists are personality disorder, but this is a person with a personality disorder who's very dangerous. Unfortunately, the candidate the Democratic Party chose is not fit for the task. I'll end there. Of challenging. I don't think at this point, we're so far in the muck. We're living in a society in which significant minorities within the police and the military are neo-Nazis. So it's gonna take commitment on the ground on the part of people of conscience and radicals to turn the ship around.
Wow. I'm just going to let everyone unmute themselves and thank you for being here. So everyone, please unmute yourself to thank Professor Fernández. And I'm going to send a list of all of these resources that you've given us. And I think that we also need to have a conversation about strategy, tactics. I know we all have to read your book to even just get into how creative the young lords were with so amazing. So
I spent a lifetime writing this book, and I wrote it for this moment. And I crafted it for a broader audience. And it's a riveting story. Not only is it about the young lords and their riveting campaigns and creativity. And by the way, I think that their creativity is a byproduct of the fact that they were children of migration who spoke 2 languages, who were also colonized and made common cause with Black Americans. But it's also a history of the period. And it's a history of the revolutionary politics of the period of Maoism and revolutionary nationalism. and the challenges and shortcomings of those ideas. But regardless of, and it's also about the state, but it's also about those conditions that I mentioned earlier are integral to the rise of social movements. So I encourage all of you to pick it up. I promise you that you will not be disappointed. I crafted it over many, 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 many years, and I missed many deadlines because I didn't write this book for my profession. I wrote it for those who want to fight for a new world.
Thank you. We're all very lucky to have it in this moment. We should actually do a book, a reading group specifically for the book, and then just digging into all of the strategies, tactics, and what our moment means. Because like you said, like we are talking about the abolition of the police, like in the New York Times. This is a very exciting moment. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll let everyone else say thank you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I learned a lot.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I've learned so much. I'm really looking forward to reading the book, and thank you for allowing us to record this so that we can share it with more people as well.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful
Thank you.
weekend.
And sorry we went over, but
No,
We're lucky
yeah,
you gave us that extra time.
have a great one.